Good afternoon and welcome to the Chamber's Business Beat Speaker Series. I'm Bruce Stidworthy, President and CEO of Bohannon Houston and Chair-elect of the Greater Albuquerque Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for joining our virtual event today, the second of 4 Business Beat events, allowing for the business community to hear directly from high-level experts and decision makers on timely and relevant topics. Today is beat number 2, and we're talking about New Mexico's finances and economy ahead of what will be a very important 60-day legislature session that will be beginning next month. To put it mildly, our state budget is in territory it's never been in before, larger than ever, with still billions more in surplus projected ahead. Oil and gas prices and production remain high, driving growth across the state's revenue streams. Meanwhile, small businesses continue their COVID recovery. Finding qualified workers for all employers remains a challenge. And recent student achievement data points to continued problems in our education system, which affect both workforce development and the ability to recruit new companies and skilled professionals to our state, all of which, of course, is not news to you all. Our just re-elected governor, the Senate, and the House, with a new speaker, by the way, will have quite an opportunity this session to make spending decisions they could only dream of prior to now. We're living in interesting times. How can we make them count? How can we ensure these year after year windfalls aren't wasted? What problems can we finally address? We're really thankful today to have a legislative veteran and state budget expert like David Abbey with us to give us his perspective on these and other questions. Before we get to David, though, let me take a moment to recognize the really great companies and organizations who are sponsoring today's event. First off, P&M Resources President and CEO, Don Terry. New Mexico Mutual President and CEO, Kelly Mixon. The University of New Mexico and its president, Garnett Stokes, including UNM Health Sciences Center, UNM Health, UNM Comprehensive Cancer Center, UNM Athletics, and UNM Rainforest Innovations. Molina Healthcare Plan President, Carolyn Ingram. Bernalillo County Manager, Julie Morgus-Baca. Western Sky Community Care Vice President, Quinn Lopez. Central New Mexico Community College President, Tracy Hartzler. Albertsons Market Street Regional Vice President, Travis Cheney. Comcast Vice President, Chris Dunkeson. Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Mexico President, Janice Torres. French Funerals and Cremations President and CEO, Tom Antrim. Fidelity Investments Vice President of Public Affairs, Leanne Kravitz. Esparza Digital and Advertising CEO, Del Esparza. Wagner Equipment Vice President of Power Systems, Brian Roth. U.S. Bank Vice President, Liz Earls. New Mexico Gas Company President, Ryan Shell. Pattern Energy Manager and Project Development, Angela Gonzalez. Excellent Schools New Mexico Executive Director, Scott Heineman. Ultra Health President and CEO, Duke Rodriguez. Presbyterian President and CEO, Dale Maxwell. James President and COO, Shad James. U.S. Eagle President and CEO, Marcia Majors. My company, Bohannon Houston, and then J.D. Bullington, Government Relations. We really appreciate our great sponsors. We could not do these events without their assistance. And so special thank you to the sponsors. Okay, I'm going to pass it off now to our Chamber President and CEO, Terry Cole, and she's going to introduce our speaker. Terry?
Thank you, Bruce. And I agree with everything you said in your opening. From a budget standpoint, especially so close to a global pandemic, I don't imagine anyone could have ever predicted that we'd have over an $8 billion budget with billions in revenue growth still ahead. And I echo your point, Bruce, the business community, and in fact, all residents, are really counting on the state to get the right priorities and make changes we've needed to make for quite some time. On everything from taxes and infrastructure to public education improvements and workforce development. So let's jump in. David Abbey is the director of the New Mexico Legislative Finance Committee. He's with us today for the third straight year, and we're so lucky and so grateful to him. On behalf of the legislature, David oversees the construction of the budget each year, keeps legislators apprised of fiscal and economic developments in the state, and leads a staff of program evaluators who analyze the effectiveness of various programs in state government. David has led the LFC for well over 20 years, and he was previously the Chief Investment Officer for the State Treasurer, Director of the Board of Finance, and DFA's Chief Economist. Before entering state government, he worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory, where he researched the environmental impacts of energy policy. David has a bachelor's degree in economics from Brown University. David has a steady hand and is widely respected by Republicans and Democrats alike in the legislature. And David, after David presents, he'll take some questions from our chamber staff and board, and hopefully from many of you. During his presentation, if you'd like to pose a question, just type it in the Q&A box on your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Welcome, David. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Terry. I think between Bruce and Terry, you've kind of covered my presentation, which is good about our condition. Next slide. So this first bullet is sort of an inside joke, but about a week ago, I figured I just started my 39th year in state government. And I started as a revenue estimator. That year was Governor Naya's first year, and the general fund was $870 million. So we've had extraordinary growth in our state economy and state revenues over that period. You know, bringing us up to the current era, of course, the Great Recession devastated New Mexico economy and revenues. And LFC staff called the decade of the teens the lost decade. Why? Weak energy markets, extreme fiscal volatility. There was one day, there were periods where we thought general fund reserves were in the negative, which of course is not legal. Numerous special sessions, tough political environment at the Roundhouse, and lots of litigation. In effect, folks saying that the state is doing it wrong and they know how to do it better. And some of the reasons of the Zuni lawsuit on capital outlay, Martinez Yazzie, I need an E on that term right there, on inadequacy of operating budget for schools, litigation involving child protective services, developmentally disabled. That's the environment in that tough decade of kind of very erratic energy markets, some negative revenue growth, and tremendous pressures to address the state needs. Next slide. And of course, some of the litigation partly related to we're last in many items, it seems like, and literally last in education, one of the most important factors we have. This just came out a month or so ago, 50th in math and reading on a national assessment of education progress. 49th in per capita personal income. There's been a lot of attention appropriately to this labor force participation rate. You know, we're 5% below the national average in the numbers of New Mexicans who are in the workforce. And the consequences of education performance and economic performance is social conditions that are really worrisome. High ranking of children in poverty, violent crime, child maltreatment. We have not made the right progress on internet access, especially in rural parts of the state. Our healthcare insurance program, Medicaid, the federally supported program, half of the population is enrolled in Medicaid. And 75% of the births in New Mexico are on Medicaid. So because of our economic conditions, we have social conditions which are not acceptable. Next slide. Somewhat related to the last decade. This is what budgeting was like in that last decade for the last 10 or 12 years. And I think you all know this isn't the way to run a railroad lurching from one year to the next from, let's say, 12.7% revenue growth in FY11. At the same time, we thought revenues weren't as high and spending was cut 2.7%. 15.8% revenue growth in 18, but minus 8% in 16. Lurching through that decade is what it was like. Next slide. And then, of course, the pandemic was a disaster for the nation and New Mexico. There was one day where oil prices were negative. You know, early coming out of the pandemic, we thought oil prices were in the teens, but we've come roaring back. Oil prices went over 100 for a while. Jobs were only 9,000 below the pre-pandemic peak. And some of the sectors in our state are doing extremely well. I flagged tourism and construction and mining with growth in employment in the last couple of months around 10%, which is extraordinary. October job growth statewide was 4%, November 3%. Again, extraordinary. We're not at the bottom of job growth in our region. We're more to the middle of the pack. And the energy economy is booming. You know, the fracking revolution. Multiple production zones per well, fracking, wells drilling as many as 12 different directions from one pad. So productivity in drilling has soared in the Permian Basin, productivity per well. And coming out of the pandemic, oil prices have doubled in 2 years. Natural gas prices have tripled to the point, incredibly, we're the second biggest producer in the nation in oil, right behind, well, not right behind Texas. They're way ahead of us, but of course, population-wise, we're very different. And that shows up in production per capita. This says we're third, but we'll see a chart in a minute. We're second in production per capita. We're ahead of Alaska in production per capita and just behind North Dakota and way ahead of Texas. And now our energy and permanent fund revenue is approaching 50% of general fund revenue. That's mostly good, but it brings us back to the problem of volatility. Let's go ahead a slide or two and we'll look at some of this data. On the left, you can see our oil prices, oil blue and natural gas, that orangish color. This is a 20-year look. Oil prices $20 20 years ago, and now we're on oil. Went over 100 today. However, just in the last 2 days, oil dropped $10. It was 82 Monday or last Friday, and 72 today. And natural gas prices also dropping. So it just can make everybody a little bit crazy, the ups and downs of oil. But under any scenario, it is outstanding for our state, whether at these range of prices. Production has soared in the middle graph. Let's see, when I started, I mentioned 1984, 83, New Mexico was producing 200,000 barrels per day. We were fifth in the nation, and now we're producing 1.7 million barrels a day. So we've grown 8.5 times in that period. Natural gas production has doubled. That's a 4-year period we can see there. And if you bear with me, I want to find one other thing about how dependent we are on oil and gas. These are
David, you bumped your mute button there.
Got it.
There we go.
$1 change in oil prices is 48 million for the general fund. 48 million. And I just described in 2 days, we lost $10 a barrel. That is a tough environment to manage and plan for. 10-cent change in natural gas is $20 million for the general fund. We've gone from $2 to $10 to $8 to probably $5.50. And even it's good story in the Wall Street Journal today about oil and gas inventories, and there's a concern we're heading back down to $4 prices. So production is strong, prices are strong, but maybe weakening trends because of the prospect of recession. Next slide. These are the charts on how we rank among all states. Texas, the highest in green. The scale's different on the right than on the left is New Mexico and North Dakota, but we vastly surpassed North Dakota. They've lost 25% of their production and not recovered. And then production per capita. And the point of the slide on the right really is New Mexico's a rich state in fiscal terms. We're poor economically for the condition of our citizens, but rich in state finances now, with again half our revenues coming from oil and gas and that high production per capita. Next slide. Here's just a kind of a picture of a revenue report that we put out yesterday. I just going to go into a little detail to give you some sense of the dramatic gains just in year over year. And you can also see that on the slide. The purple on the top is September, July through September 22. Green is a year ago. Red is 2 years ago. We've almost doubled 2 years ago, albeit 2 years ago was in the pandemic, July 20, but we've doubled since July 20 in revenue. Let's see, year over year, personal income and corporate income is up 61%. Gross receipts is up 31%. Oil revenues are up 75%. Investment income is mostly up, but some losses on short-term bonds. So a dramatic revenue picture, which will be reflected in a new revenue estimate that's coming out on Monday. These are very almost odd things to see such dramatic changes in revenue conditions for a government. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we have piles of money, great needs, but it is also important to think about our ability to address them. And the reality is New Mexico and the US economy are at full employment. New Mexico unemployment is 4.4%. And state government struggles to hire more workers, just like the private sector. And that's especially true in state governments for some of the critical professions like engineers, architects, nurses, project managers. So agency after agency comes in and reports initiatives in the hearings this fall, asking for money for next fiscal year from the legislature to grow, to hire more people, to spend more on contracts. But the question comes up repeatedly, well, where are you going to get the people to do the work? And then you move to capital outlay, and the state has $3.5 billion in unspent capital outlay appropriations for 4,100 projects. And we have obviously a lot of money to address our capital outlay needs, which are significant, but we almost have gridlock given the amount of unfinished projects at the same time folks want to do new ones. Next slide. So in August, when the LSC and DFA presented the revenue outlook, we talked about a operating budget about a revenue structure that would allow growth in the operating budget up to $2.5 billion. That's what we call new money. That's next year's estimated revenue compared to this year's spending around $8.5 billion, an extraordinary 30%. And when we see new estimates on Monday, 8 o'clock, we'll be on Zoom, for those of you who are really interested, that number is going to go up significantly. And so what do we do with all that money? The first goal, obviously, is to adequately fund what we're doing right now. And that's tough when inflation is in the 8% range. There's strong wage growth. We thought we did well with 7% raises in the spring and starting the new fiscal year. And yet inflation is really chipping away at us, just as it is in your businesses and industries. FY23 spending was up 13%. We've grown spending 33% from FY19 to FY23. Think about, I talked about the lost decade. We've come roaring out of that with government spending. The needs are there. Government is providing a significant increase in services, but given economic conditions, unemployment rates, availability of workforce, availability of critical professions, it's going to be hard to do a lot more. And I would also note that many legislators' memory is fresh from the 2020 special session where they thought they were doing great things on Martinez-Yazzie on education reform. And then they had to pare back, they had to cut almost all the budgets and roll back salary increases. So legislators are wary about continuing to grow budgets at a double-digit rate. Does anyone know how many more slides I have? I do. It's about 7 or 8 more. Okay, next slide. I mentioned dependence on oil and gas. Just this is a quick look at it. Directly, oil and gas, this is the August estimate, over a third directly. And that number will only grow when we get the new revenue estimates on Monday. We'll be pushing 40% directly from oil and gas. Next slide. So a little more on building a budget for FY24. LFC will come out with its recommendation early in January, along with the governor. Employee compensation and recruitment are front and center. To enhance recruitment and retention are front and center. Improving school outcomes obviously is important. LFC for a number of years and some legislators have really pushed extended learning. We call it K-12 plus, was K-5 plus. K-5 plus was adding 25 days to the calendar. We need to reform the calendar. We worry about summer learning slide. An extended school year will help with that. Kids lost at least 2 months per year during the pandemic. We just have catch up from that alone, much less gaining ground from our overall ranking. Medicaid is a huge challenge in budget making. We're facing some reduction in federal funds coming out of the pandemic. And there is great interest in the legislature in boosting provider rates to help enhance services for Medicaid. Again, I mentioned half our New Mexicans are on Medicaid. On Tuesday, LSC will have a report on the Medicaid program that is going to really raise a lot of flags about we have 50% insured, but are they getting the services that we're paying for? Big issue. Increasing provider rates will help that. In addition, there are many new initiatives that we're going to hear a lot about. The Opportunity Scholarship Program, free tuition for all, was funded mostly with non-recurring money. There's going to be a desire to reduce the number of uninsured, those not on private insurance or Medicaid or Medicare. There's going to be a big push to continue nearly free childcare for most New Mexico parents. I mentioned extending learning, big investments in higher education to expand nursing slots, loan for service programs for healthcare providers. Crime will be much discussed, even a small program, but there's some interest in expanding funding for legal aid type services. Next slide. So plenty of ways to spend money. I said already, the legislature doesn't want to get way above, way into the double digits. So certainly tax reform is something that needs to be talked about. During last session, there was a 0.25% reduction in the gross receipts tax and 8% this year and 8% next year. An 0.1% cost about $100 million. And, this is really a problem. You can see on the bottom right how much the gross receipts tax has risen over a couple decades from the 6% range to the 8.5% range. And that really matters if you're in the service industry and you're paying gross receipts tax on services while our neighboring states aren't. So if you're a corporation and you need legal services or architect services and corporate headquarters are in Texas, you just soon buy those services in Texas rather than New Mexico. That's the pyramiding problem. We think that the effective rate on some service sectors is 15 to 20%, and that's a challenge for our economy. So gross receipts tax reductions could be, as well as addressing pyramiding, could be a potential use of funding. There's a lot of discussion about the need to provide lower to middle income relief in the personal income tax. 75% of our taxpayers are paying the 5% rate, which until recently was the top rate. In other words, we're going from no taxes at around, say, let's 30,000 to the same rate all the way up to 350,000. So there's an interest in stepping up that top rate towards 5% as income rises. And I also mentioned road fund revenues. We're losing revenue from the gas tax due to fuel economy. That may be an opportunity to shift some state revenues to the road, general fund revenues to the road fund, where we're not collecting enough on a recurring basis. Next slide. Capital outlay, we can do better. Some of the things that we're looking at, we need $70 million for a forensic unit at the state hospital in Las Vegas. The Texas versus New Mexico lawsuit poses significant cost on the state to try to deliver more water to Texas. Public safety communication systems, county courthouses. I mentioned all the unfinished projects. The legislature and advocates all need to do a better job of making sure we're funding projects that are ready to go. Next slide. Here's another version of the same thing. Appropriations have soared in the last few years as the energy economy has recovered. We went from 600 million in 21 to over 2 billion in last session, 2022. But we're barely growing spending as the availability of funding has increased so much. So obviously balance spend has shrunk to, what's that show? 10% expended in Q1, Q3, 10% of the 3.5 billion outstanding. Next slide. I'm nearly wrapping this up. So what does it take not to be last? I think about it all the time. I think a lot of us do up here. What does it take not to be last? And this isn't an easy question. And especially in an environment we have lots of money and some significant constraints on spending money to address our state needs. So we want to invest what works for a wide range of government programs and services. We want to invest in job training programs, in education that relates to workforce needs. We want to manage for results. LFC is working to implement a program we call Legistat, which is managing and using data for results, where we try to prioritize and prioritize spending to the programs that have the greatest return on investment. And we want to smooth revenue volatility. A watchword that I hear from some key legislators is, how can we turn now money into future money? And that's things like putting money into university endowments, putting money into the permanent funds, and then trust funds for water and conservation, scholarships, early childhood, tobacco, even pension funds. I think that's it. Next slide. Oh, the point of this last slide, why do we want to take now money and convert it to future money? Because we're looking over the hill, 2022, again, producing 1 million barrels a day, going from 500,000 to 1 million, heading up to 2 million a day on this chart. But this wealth is coming at a time when the world is talking all about decarbonization. there's almost an imperative because of climate change to think about how can we use less oil and gas. Just in the last 2 days, the International Energy Administration put out a forecast describing explosive growth in renewable energy, solar, wind, a battery revolution. Well, what's that mean? It means in 5 to 10 years, we're going to be looking at less demand for oil and gas. So it's odd, even as this national push is happening to decarbonize, in New Mexico, we're benefiting from the extraordinary resource richness of the Permian Basin, but it's not going to last. The good news, it might be 10 years out. We'll probably hopefully be producing as much oil in 10 years as we are now. But in the long run, the outlook, I think many want our oil production to decline in the long run and in decades to come, because that's part of a sustainable world relating to addressing climate change. And last slide is just simply reminding us, it sort of feels like in state finances that we have a new paradigm, that we talk a lot about wanting to stay on trend and worrying about getting off trend, but it might be that there's a new trend with this oil and gas that makes us feel more comfortable about perhaps reducing tax revenues with tax reform and feeling more comfortable about spending money as we have established many of the growth in trust funds and permanent funds. So that's it. I'm ready to answer questions, Bruce.
All right, excellent, David. Tremendous presentation, as always, packed with tons of data. Audience, as Terry noted earlier, if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box. And as we go here, I'll monitor that and we'll get to as many of those as we can. We do have a few questions that we're going to start off with. And the first one is going to be from Janice Torres with Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Mexico. Janice, so glad you're with us. Go right ahead with your question.
Hey, thank you, Bruce, and great to see and hear from you, David. You talked a bit about tax reform. So with respect to gross receipts taxes, many in the business community believe three things: that the overall GRT rate is too high and is in need of substantial reduction, that GRT pyramiding, which you talked about, hurts small businesses in particular and makes us less competitive economically compared to other places, and that even if the state reduces its portion of the GRT, it's really easy for cities and counties to raise their portion and counteract part or all of the benefits. Are these fair assumptions? And is there enough appetite in the legislature to address all three in a serious way this year?
Tax rate reduction and pyramiding. I think there's quite an interest, especially in I can look around the legislature and think of some legislative leaders who are really pushing this, and they're the leaders I count on. So I'd say yes on rate reduction, yes on pyramiding. This is a path to prosperity, and the governor signed 0.25% last session. So there's some precedent from the executive as well to look at it. But the problem with the local governments is really significant, and that is just politically, the local governments have a lot of needs, especially in corrections, for example, public safety, vacancy rates in their jails, and so politically that's hard, and so it makes the state efforts perhaps counterproductive. So that's a harder one.
Thank you, David. Great question, Janice. I understand, Janice, you have another question for David.
Yes, I do, Terry. Thank you. So, David, over the past few years, there have been attempts to make more and more things operated or controlled by the state government. Attempts to create a public bank, create a public utility, mandate public retirement plans, and a push to push out private health insurance in favor of a single payer system. So many of these things are poor and costly solutions in search of a problem, and they'll hurt our private sector economy. What are your thoughts on these kinds of proposals? And do you get a sense that the legislature, as a body, will continue going in this direction?
Well, you know, that old saw, elections matter. So you look at the election results carefully this year, and that agenda, that expansionary agenda, was supported at the elections for the legislature and for the governor in a lot of ways. Just look at today's paper about the governor talking about the desire of addressing poverty. It's in the journal this morning. So I see that push continuing. I think the good news for your folks is that there are people who want to pursue those initiatives, but they also want to do it in a responsible way. And there are mechanisms like fiscal impact reports and, you know, the open capital and the willingness to accept testimony and, frankly, pretty effective recommendation from industry at the Capitol. And so they're going to want to have the right information, and they're going to want to make sure they don't take steps that can, you know, kill the goose that laid the golden egg. So I just think the political environment is for those initiatives to continue, along with a willingness to hear your concerns. And you just gotta, especially in the appropriations committees, there's a lot of conversation about show us the data. And that's true for the advocates of these initiatives, and it's true for those who are concerns about how it will affect ongoing activities in employment. Show us the data.
Great, thank you, David.
Oh, yeah, thank you, David. Sorry, I was on mute there. So I have a question for you. You know, like in the private sector and sort of in our personal, you know, financial situations, when times are good, at least those with a, you know, a little bit more financially conservative outlook would tend to look at debt reduction as a first choice to move money from here to the future, as your slides alluded to. And I have to confess my ignorance about some aspects of the state finances, but are there opportunities to reduce, pay down debt and thereby reduce future debt service payments and in that way move money from now to the future?
That's a good question. And I think it's pretty limited for one reason, especially that the state's debt structure is pretty short. The longest debt it issues for severance tax bonds is 10 years and a little longer for roads. But the state hasn't even borrowed for roads for 6 or 7 years, as it's used general fund to support, use cash in effect to support road needs. And the conversation this year, at least in the finance committee, is not to issue debt going forward, at least for senior severance tax bonds, and instead to cash fund capital outlay. And so when you have a short-term debt structure to begin with, funding new projects with cash rather than refunding outstanding debt is kind of get to a similar place.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. One other question, if I could.
I'm sorry, Bruce. And one other thing about it: the money the bonds that are outstanding, they are at very low interest rates. We borrowed 3 or 4 years ago, 1 or 2%. So refinancing debt borrowed that cheap in an 8% environment isn't necessarily cost effective.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I want to ask you a little bit about infrastructure. You alluded to this a little bit in your slides on capital outlay. I guess to shorten the question down a little bit, what do you think the legislature may have an appetite to do as it relates to better vetting and prioritization of capital outlay? Last year, we made a little bit of progress in terms of transparency as it relates to which legislators are supporting which capital outlay projects. But instituting a process that would, I don't know, I guess the right way to say it would be provide more scrutiny on capital outlay and prioritize projects would be beneficial. A lot of states do it. What's your sense on the legislature's appetite for that?
So LSC had a capital outlay subcommittee this year, and capital outlay reform has been talked about every year for decades, and like what changes? Maybe we could pull up slide 14. I don't know if that's possible,
Chelsea,
but it shows a vetting checklist. And if you think back, the legislature funds some things that may strike you all as an oddity, but they do a bill called House Bill 2 Junior. It's operating budget allocated to each member on a per member basis. And the governor vetoed the junior bill last spring. And the outcome of that was the governor saying, vet this stuff better. And the governor's right about that. The legislature needs to do better. And that led into this vetting checklist is just common sense stuff. Prioritize health and safety, make sure that the project is on an infrastructure plan, make sure that the total project cost is estimated by a professional rather than somebody guessing. Try to have the land owned before you appropriate money for a building construction project. These are common sense things. Already this year, the legislature has changed the form to require all members to fill out this information. It's simple. It's only on one page. But previously, all a member had to do was put in a request for amount and name who gets it. And now they have to provide minimal information like this on a form. Well, this leads to discussions with both House Appropriations and House Tax and Revenue, Senate Finance. Can we have some groups starting to look at how these forms are filled out when members submit their list? Can we do some review of them rather than just put them in automatically? So this isn't, I wouldn't call it revolutionary change. It's incremental change, but I think it's a step in the right direction.
yeah, good. Thank you. One question related, I guess, here from Mike Canfield in our audience, and former chair here at the chamber. Regarding the 4,100 capital outlay projects, are those broken down in categories like time outstanding or ones that are at risk of not getting done?
That's a good question. It's interesting. There are not that many of that are older than 2019 because of weak revenues. There were a period where there weren't many appropriations for capital outlay. So most of them are the last 3 or 4 years. Capital outlay appropriations funded from severance tax bonds typically have a reversion clause on them if they don't get spent or encumbered in 3 years. And so as we move forward in the next couple of years, we're going to see growing numbers of projects that are going to end because there's inadequate funding or something they couldn't get the land, or for a range of reasons they're stalled and the money's going to revert. One of the problems is there's so many of them. You can guess that many of them are worthy and probably could go forward if they had the right project management, but that's lacking. And so there isn't, just for that many projects, there isn't basic information on how much is the funding short. And so the legislature and the executive are going to recommend more funding this year in sort of pots to be allocated, say, by DFA to fully fund projects. In higher ed, there's probably a likelihood of 20 million or more for higher ed projects appropriated prior years to bring them up more to the full cost when we know construction inflation is 20 to 30%. But I'm somewhat concerned again about sort of gridlock, just because of the overwhelming number of them and probably the basically insufficiency of state agencies and local governments to employ the staff to manage and advance these projects. It's interesting even to find projects that were stalled for failure to get an appraisal. I mean, I'm probably telling you what you all know. It's hard to find an appraiser for 6 months.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the supply chain issues have gotten deep, as well as cost inflation have gotten deep into this problem, and I'm worried about gridlock. So,
Bruce, I'll jump in with a question.
Okay, Terry, go right ahead.
David, you know, every legislative session, you well know, as many of us have been working this for a long time, know is different. So we never can really forecast exactly what that difference is going to be. But when I think about this upcoming session, I think it's worthwhile thinking about this a bit. And I think of the word new. We have a new Speaker of the House. We have, 17 or 18 new members in the House, many of whom won their races by pretty slim margins. Then on the Senate side, we, don't have that much change, but we do have Representative Maestas jumping over to become a senator. And knowing Representative Maestas, who we have worked with quite well over the years, he doesn't let any grass grow under his feet. So I expect he will move quickly and aggressively. And then we have a governor in her last 4 years. While that's not new, it is a situation where we don't have a governor running for any kind of reelection. So tick those off for me and tell me what kind of effect you think any of them might have or might not have on this session, which might help us sort of figure out what we're getting into.
So I don't want to get too ahead of the decisions that a new legislative leadership in the House makes, but the House has expert fiscal leadership. It's Representative Lindstrom. She's been in the legislature for 20 years, and she's been chair for a number of years, and she's worked effectively with the LFC staff. And we have Senator Munoz on the Senate side, who's been in the legislature over a dozen years and has a lot of fiscal experience. And then you look at the committee makeup, and Senate Finance wouldn't change much, maybe one new seat. House Appropriations, only one Democrat looks like they're leaving from last year, assuming there aren't changes in appointments, and there are some new Republican members. So I'm meaning to describe continuity of leadership and rank and file membership on the appropriations committees. And I think that goes a long way to help the legislature deal with, these obviously very tough issues we face in a responsible way. That we've got a fairly steady, somebody said that about me, but in fact, that's true about the legislative fiscal leadership in the committees, a strong, steady hand on both sides. So that helps. Senator Worth, the Senate leadership, Senator Stewart, decades of experience. Worth was on House Appropriations. Javier Martinez was on House Tax and Rev. So some of the new leadership has that fiscal experience. So I'm very positive about that. The executive clearly has some challenges replacing key staff, DFA, the chief of staff. So, everyone want to keep all eyes on that. And that's extremely important for those transitions to happen pretty soon, I think.
Yeah, well, I think I said you had the steady hand, by the way, and you do indeed. So thank goodness we have you.
Yes, I think we, Terry, if it's okay, we have time for one more question. And there's a question from the audience, and it relates back to your earlier comments, David, about challenges with our workforce. The question says, state and central New Mexico has low unemployment rates, but also has low labor participation. You noted that in your slides. With employers struggling to find skilled workers, what efforts are legislators considering to address this issue? And of course, it's not just private sector employers who are struggling to find skilled workers. It's state and local government, as you alluded to, with the challenges of getting those projects, to progress. So, do you see any movement to try to address that? I'm not sure what the legislature might do, but any thoughts on that?
Well, our number one focus is on the professions that serve state government, which is near crisis areas. And I've mentioned healthcare, social workers. An appropriation of $50 million was made to establish endowments at colleges and universities. Of course, we also more important than just state government workers is our professional workers in our private sector. And, higher education is a key part of that. Free tuition, opportunity scholarship may help that. We've declined in higher ed enrollment 20%. 20% in more than 10 years. And it reversed this year by about 2 to 4%, depending on the level. So for the long view, we need to be extremely focused on public and higher education. And, when math and reading proficiency is 30% on average and lower for certain disadvantaged groups, like 15%, 10% in some areas, you can tell where our prospects are. So we are right for the long view to do the best we can on public education. Extended learning, I've mentioned already, is key. Higher education, greater access, higher graduation rates. I think we're very focused on that. I'm not 100% sure we're doing the right things. Probably in terms of more specialized vocational type training, there's a lot of conversation in the last year about the high school levels and vocational schools and transition to college, and that not every youngster needs to go to college. And I would look for some more funding to many school districts, to like Rio Rancho. I took a tour, and the businesses in that area have been extremely positive about helping acquire a campus for a vocational school in Rio Rancho. It's a great project. There's one in Hobbs. I'd look for more of that. So that's a partial answer. I think we could do more.
Okay, very good. Thank you, David. I appreciate you being so forthcoming and candid with us today. It really helps us understand what to expect for the session this year, and I'm sure we'll cross paths up there once things get underway. I'm going to hand it off to Janice Torres to close us out today. Janice?
Bruce, may I say one thing real quick?
Sure.
Just, gosh, everybody come to the Capitol. It can be fun, it can be exciting, and you can really make a difference, your presence at the Capitol. So please come see me.
Good encouragement. Thank you. Okay, Janice?
Thank you, Bruce, and I totally agree. David, thank you. That was an incredible, informative presentation and conversation. As a business community, we certainly believe that a cash flush state government is a good thing, and certainly better than the alternative, which we've experienced far too many times before. However, when revenues are booming, and especially when they look like they'll stay that way for a little while, it's tempting for everything to become a priority. So we hope that doesn't play out. It's clear that now is the time to reform our tax code, adopt big changes to make New Mexico an easier place to do business, more competitive with other states, and more tax friendly for workers, families, and businesses alike. It's also time to focus our capital spending on rebuilding the foundations of our economy and communities. In 20 years, we shouldn't look back and say, if only we had spent those infrastructure dollars more wisely. It's time to commit to changing our public education system, one school at a time. And we can do that by investing in proper training, development, and pay for truly great school leaders. Great principals will turn struggling schools into increasingly better schools. If we want better student performance, we need the very best leaders in our schools who have the expectations and know how to get it done. And finally, this is near and dear to my heart. We must invest in ensuring our criminal justice system can stand up to the career criminals who continue to run rampant on our streets. Stop catching and releasing them, put more officers on the streets to stop them, raise prosecutors' pay to attract and retain the very best attorneys to put them behind bars, and invest in new technology and data analysis to ensure our justice system becomes smarter than these career criminals. We live in a wonderful place, but we face some big challenges that we have hung around our state for far too long. Being laser focused, and yes, with a big surplus, we can get it done. So on behalf of the Chamber, we would once again like to thank these great sponsors of today's Business Beat event: P&M, UNM, New Mexico Mutual, Molina, Bernalillo County, Western Sky Community Care, C&M, Albertsons Market, Comcast, Ultra Health, Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Mexico, French Funerals and Cremations, Excellent Schools New Mexico, US Bank, Fidelity, Esparza, Wagner, Padron, James, Bohannon Houston, US Eagle, Presbyterian, New Mexico Gas Company, and J.D. Bullington Government Relations. We want to thank each and every one for attending today's second installment of the 2022-23 Business Beat Speaker Series. Our next event in the series won't be until March, when we talk homelessness and the revitalization of downtown Albuquerque. We wish you all many blessings for a wonderful holiday season, and we'll see you in 2023.